Hi, welcome to the first session of Poetic and Cinematic Evil by Jason Mohaghegh. This seminar explores evil as a complex poetic and cinematic force. Accordingly, we will trace the dark experiments of four specific poets: Arthur Rimbaud, Anna Akhmatova, Georg Trakl, and Ahmad Shamlu, alongside four selected films as they traverse the following conceptual territories: decadence, cruelty, derangement, and mystery. We will note how the poetics of evil can inhabit the literary genres of the rant, the elegy, the riddle, and the nocturne. We will note how the cinematics of evil can feature figures of the deviant, the whisperer, the lunatic, and the killer. Furthermore, we will observe how these creative works apply certain rare techniques of language and image, tongue and vision, that unveil the intimate relationship between evil, seduction, atrocity, chaos, and rage. We will also ask overarching questions about the bond between evil and thought. This course is taught by Jason Mohaghegh, who is an associate professor of comparative literature at Babson College. His scholarly focus is upon tracking currents of experimental thought between the Middle East and the West, with particular attention to exploring the concepts of chaos, violence, illusion, silence, madness, futurism, disappearance, and apocalyptic aesthetics. He has published several books to date, including The Chaotic Imagination, New Literature and Philosophy of the Middle East, Palgrave Macmillan, 2010, Inflictions, The Writing of Violence in the Middle East, Continuum, 2012, The Radical Unspoken, Silence in the Middle East and Western Thought, Routledge, 2013, Insurgent Poet, Mystic, Sectarian, The Four Masks of an Eastern Postmodernism, SUNY, 2015, Homicide, Mania, Fatality, and the Future in Delirium, MIT Press, Urbanic Sequence, 2019, and Night, A Philosophy of the After Dark, Zero Books, 2019. He is also the co-editor of the Suspensions book series with Bloomsbury Press and the co-director of the Fifth Disappearance Lab. So Jason, I think you could take it away.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining the inner circles of hopefully what should be a very compelling and strange approach to the question of evil, because we're wrenching it from the domains of the typical domains of theology and philosophy and morality, and we're going to follow it into its styles, its atmospheres, and its storytelling mechanisms more than anything. So when you do that, when you have that vantage or that entry point, why is evil automatically related to storytelling? There are many reasons, there's many criterion of that, one of which is that evil is bound to storytelling in that the storyteller, and we learned this from Walter Benjamin, is the first figure that children are introduced to who pronounces finality to them, who explains death, is a harbinger of death, in that they literally speak the words the end. And the child becomes conscious of the human becomes conscious of the fact that things end, that phenomena have expiration dates, that we're in an impermanent or transient world of decay. And so that's the first thing, because death has always been intimately linked to evil, right? It's, if you remember, it's Eve's eating of the apple that leads her to not just exile from the garden, but what's the ultimate sort of price is mortality, right? Sort of the forfeiture of immortality. So death has always been sort of part of that. And the storyteller is precisely the figure who not only pronounces the finality of things, that the story ends, but that once it ends, it is irreversible. The character who died has died absolutely, cannot be resuscitated or rewritten into existence. So that's something important. Also, the fact that evil operates through intimations. And intimation is a word that means a suggestive hint, a kind of half-telling, sort of a partial glimpse. So Alice's relationship to the white rabbit is an intimation. But it also, notice, has the etymology of intimacy. So whereas gods and figures of the good make pronouncements from transcendent heights of distance, of absolute distance, of impossible faroism, the devil is the one who gets up close, who whispers in the ear, who speaks at intimate proximity with others. So that's another thing, the reason why it's connected to storytelling, because storytelling has been always a ritual exercise of intimacy, from ancient times to tribal associations to all kinds of others. So that close range power of insinuation is there. Third is that storytelling has always been an exercise of idleness. Now, there are instrumentalized forms of storytelling, meaning narratives that serve certain purposes of belonging. Those are typically myths that do that sort of associate the ethnos of a people or the kind of nationalism or before wars. So storytelling can become co-opted in that. But if we take the purest, which is to say the most impure ancient form, the ancestral form of storytelling, it's pure wasted time. It's an exercise in the luxuriation of wasted time, of idleness. And as we know, the expression, idle hands are the devil's workshop, right? So idleness has always been linked to the serpent, who's just lazy, sort of lazily slithering in the garden, right? So there's that. And finally, storytelling is, in the most practical, functional terms, the elevation of a single incident, right? A tale, a happening, an event, to some all-encompassing level of momentary importance. You drown in it, you become immersed in the story, but very violently at the expense of all other things that exist. And that goes backward and forward. You're suspended in a kind of encapsulated space-time of the narrative, wherein you become indifferent and negligent to all that has ever existed before and all that will ever exist after. And that bubble effect, that kind of monadic cloud effect, right, of insularity, is part of the seductive power of evil as well. You see, they always said that one of the great traits of the devil and one of the great allures of the devil is that he or she talks to you like you're the only person on earth. Whereas every pronouncement from the divine, from gods, has an implicit universality in it. Right? This is the same thing they tell everyone. Even if you are a prophetic figure, that's a different iteration of being the chosen. But being the chosen carries the authoritarian threat of the ability to fall from grace and become unchosen. And that's what happens to many of them. Moses gets punished. Others fall out of favor. Cain betrays the covenant. Adam betrays the covenant. Eve betrays the covenant. Satan betrays the covenant. So there's an exilic property. There's a potential loss there that's even included in that. Whereas the conversations with the devil are as if nothing else sort of supersedes you in that moment. And that's why it plays kind of beautifully to our own desires to be sort of elevated. So there's a kind of willed oblivion that's necessary to listening to a story. It's why, even just atmospherically, why they turn the lights off in the opera or in the cinema. Right? You're disappearing entire outside worlds. Right? Including, one could say, yourself, because you're in the audience and you go into the dark as well, which we'll get into that, the relationship between evil and subjectivity, how it at once exalts, but it also eviscerates subjectivity. And that's actually one of the keys to its pleasure principle, which we'll get to later. But this idea that the good always presumes a universal or total quest, whereas evil is lured by a single curiosity, ember, inflection, trace, a single motion or fascination at the expense of all else, that's going to be an important one. So as an example of this, today I want to start with storytelling. But before I do, I tell you what we're going to start with. Just so you know, this is why I want to exit kind of the domain of philosophical argumentation proper and enter the literary, poetic, and cinematic sort of descriptive sort of realm, because obviously there is no absolute theory of evil. There is no universal truth of evil. There are interesting overarching continuities across different story sources, across different traditions, across different mysticisms and all of that. But at the end of the day, I was just telling this to Nicholas, if you corner evil in a pinpoint moment, where it takes on some peculiar shape or typology, it has no presumption to being the absolute condition of evil. Evil by nature has been always defined as amorphous or shape-shifting or volatile, right? It's always been a force of disguise. And so, having said that, and it's not, let's not fall into sort of all the, I know you guys have been bombarded with the idea of multiplicity to death at this point, and it's still a great idea, and it's one that unleashes us to all kinds of becomings. But rather than just sit and dwell and say, okay, so evil is multiplicity, I actually want us to fill the void with examples. And so the examples are, for instance, in the 19th century folkloric traditions, we have evil personified often as death or as destruction in stories. Evil is sometimes a visitor to a hotel staying on the 11th floor. It can be an old woman collecting wares on a side street, a child with green eyes who whistles for no reason, a specter playing chess on the beach, a scary godmother or godfather who you didn't know exists and shows up at your door as a stranger, a filthy beggar that sits in a vagrant position on the side of the road. In the Japanese folkloric tradition of the 19th century, a fox or a wolf that crosses your path at twilight. In modern literature, so 20th century avant-garde literature, evil can take the form of a letter-writing woman who becomes enamored with a cellist. That's Jose Saramago, by the way. An accountant making notations at a cafe's corner table, a gambler with a stacked deck of cards, a traveling salesman with a con man's grin. In older ancient myths, evil can take the form of, we know dragons and we know serpents, but a lot of people have three-fanged blood-sucking sisters, a bearded man with wings, a wagon driver with a wide-brimmed hat, a ruler of crossroads who stands at each nexus of the world at midnight, a cruel judge, a guardian angel, a boatman, rider, a well-dressed aristocrat, a damsel, or a dancer. Sometimes, let's get even more specific, sometimes these caricatures are accompanied by a held object, a broom, rake, skewer, chain, coin, scythe, whip, envelope, cane, lantern, pocket watch, or notebook. I want us to get into specifically when we deal with cinema, but also right out the gates with Rimbaud, Arthur Rimbaud, the great prince of the decadence. I want us to make careful inventories of the object world and their relationships to evil. We know that evil often operates through charms, through talismans, through cursed objects, through sympathetic magical objects like the voodoo doll. And so we have to be aware of the world of things. And it has nothing to do with belief. I'm not some goofy personality who has sort of great sort of propensities to believing in these things. I see them, though, nevertheless, that doesn't mean they're devoid of power, existential power, right? Everything is, for me, an illusory articulation. That doesn't mean that they can't be manifested in extremely forceful ways. Beyond that, some of these caricatures of evil are accompanied by creatures, owls, stray cats, panthers, deer, or insects, crickets, flies, maggots, scarab beetles in the ancient Egyptian traditions. And on those most brilliant occasions of expert storytelling, evil can even assume spatial shapes in the form of an entire town or village that is the embodiment of evil, or enter even greater abstractions as a feeling, a mood, a shade, or a chill. Just becoming aware that evil can sometimes take the shape of sensation or atmosphere as well. Now, all that being said, I wanted to start with a text that is very precious to me. It's kind of a first gift. And remember, Marcel Mauss, the early anthropologist, who taught us that all gifts are also curses. They're also burdens. So I'm transmitting something which I value highly, but which also implicates you in particular ways. For instance, by the way, one of the first things that you'll read in this class as well is a piece called Tomino's Hell. Does anyone know about this? It's a work of early 20th century, I believe, Japanese literature. It's a short poem. No, it's medieval Japanese poetry that is said to cause the death of whoever reads it out loud. What do you do with that? Do you want me to send that link to you? I can send it to you. It's part of our syllabus. But the reason I bring this up is because actually in the Islamic tradition, the devil is never considered a liar. The conceptualization of the devil as a liar is an incorrect accusation. The devil is a choice giver. That's what temptation means. The opening of continual labyrinthine choices that then allow you to stumble incorrectly eventually. He just plays at the gambler's level of probability. Eventually, you'll make a wrong turn in the labyrinth. Eventually, you'll choose incorrectly. And what he knows is, intriguingly, you are the most myopic, the most misunderstood, the most confused when compelled to make decisions with regard to the self. Right? Why do you think it is that Freud makes you do those Rorschach tests and all the others, all that, to externalize perception? Because to tell stories about yourself actually is quite misleading, both for him and for you, right? So the devil makes sure that you make questions which are intimately linked to your subjectivity, to your self-image, because those are most likely to go wrong and misfire. So anyway, we'll get into all of that. But the piece that I'm going to offer for today for us to do some close reading and to have our first associations and principles of evil predicated upon those is an ancient text it's from the Egyptian pyramid scrolls titled "The Dead King Eats the Gods." And it's a fascinating, vivid, graphic, bizarre spell, more than anything else, that was etched in hieroglyphs upon the pyramid walls. And we're going to read it today. Now, how I came across this is precisely an evil exercise. I was in Algeria, and I did the most evil form of travel is to abandon the tourist's hierarchy of dominant sites that must be visited. And instead, I went in search of the original scroll, which is housed there. That took me to an old bookseller in an alleyway in Algiers, who was able to bring me to the place in the private collection where it's housed. So I got to see the original manuscript. Now, something interesting about this is that there are about 7 or 8 details in the short story that I just told you of how I procured access to this document. One of those details is false. That's one of our first other principles of evil. Evil narratively loves to intermingle truths with embellishments, distortions, or omissions. And it creates what's called a hermeneutics of suspicion. That's often used in a different way, but I like the way it sounds. Hermeneutics of suspicion here will simply mean that you're in this minefield where you're never quite sure if the piece of information that is offered to you, the single detail, is one that has been malformed or one that is true. And you've got a 50-50 shot. Now, there are certain forms of evil storytelling where you are helplessly incapable of deciphering or distinguishing which are true and which are untrue. But the best ones, which are forms of riddles and puzzles, dark riddles and puzzles, precisely allow for a form of deciphering or a form of decoding whereby you could construct an accurate criterion to be able to tell. And the reason this is done is because it's an initiation rite in and of itself for you to figure out how to read the text and realize what one of the 10 details. So in my own 2-sentence story to you, maybe it wasn't Algeria, or maybe it wasn't a bookseller, or maybe it wasn't in the alley, or maybe it wasn't this text that I'm giving. I'll leave that to you. But let's jump into it then and have some fun. So unless there's anything to say at the outset, let's get going. I'm going to share screen here. Wait a minute. Hold on one second. Are you seeing the PowerPoint at this point or no?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, great. All right. So this is our poem. Everybody seeing the poem, "The Dead King Eats the Gods"? Excellent. From the Egyptian pyramid text, 2464 BCE. That's almost 5,000 years ago. And I'm not saying this as an insult to anybody or to our contemporary era, but wow, this is far better writing than 99.9% of the things that I see out there today. So let's jump in the deep end. This line 1, the sky is a dark bowl, the stars die and fall. The celestial bows quiver, the bones of the earth gods shake, and planets come to a halt when they sight the king in all his power. The god who feeds on his father eats his mother. The king is such a tower of wisdom, even his mother can't discern his name. His glory is in the sky, his strength lies in the horizon, like that of his father, the sun god Atum, who conceived him. Atum conceived the king, but the dead king has a greater dominion. His vital spirits surround him, his qualities lie below his feet. He is cloaked in gods, and cobras coil on his forehead. His guiding snakes decorate his brow and peer into souls, ready to spit fire against his enemies. The king's head is on his torso. He is the bull of the sky, who charges and vanquishes all. He lives on the stuff of the gods. He feeds on their limbs and entrails, even when they have bloated their bodies with magic. At Nessus, the island of fire. The king is prepared and his spirits are assembled, and he appears as the mighty one, lord of holy ministers. He is seated with his back to the earth god Geb, and he passes judgment with the one whose name is concealed on this day when the oldest ones are slaughtered. He dines in sacrificial meals, binding the victims in preparation for the feast. The dead king eats men and lives on gods, and to carry messages he has couriers. Let's stop there, because there are 30 principles of evil that I want to devise based on just these first lines. All right, and let's do this together. So we start at the very beginning here. The sky is a dark bowl, the stars die and fall. Line 1, evil forms fatal enclosures. The sky is a dark bowl. A bowl is an enclosure, but it's one where stars die and fall. So it's a fatal enclosure, a form of entrapment. And it's a place where the immemorial can collapse. Excuse me. That is a highly specific tactic, to be able to take things out of the house of eternity, out of the dimension of the immemorial, and to make them vulnerable to fatality. So that's the first thing. Lines 2 and 3, the celestial bows quiver, the bones of the earth gods shake. There's a consistency there theoretically. Evil draws things into trembling, right? You can infuse things with tremulous capacities. Excuse me. Give me a second, everybody. All right, sorry for that. That's a form of malevolent animation. So we've always been intrigued in the history of storytelling with things coming to life, dolls, scarecrows, statues, and all of that, but to infuse them with malevolent purpose, malevolent animation, to make them move in wrong ways, is always part of the dimension of horror or evil. You can think of horror films, that's a very common characteristic in that genre, right? And also, even in terms of the analysis of movement, one of the ways in which we define monstrosity is precisely by their inhuman categories of movement. So the way vampires move, they almost glide with a kind of delicate elegance. Werewolves, obviously, on all fours, the way they prowl. Frankenstein's monster staggers and lurches. The zombie also kind of stumbles forward. So does the mummy. The mummy kind of with that, also that strange. So malevolent animation. The next, second. And planets come to a halt. Line 4, evil contains the power to arrest cosmological movements, right? Reversal or paralysis. That's very important. The world turns. We learn this even from Heraclitus, far earlier than Socrates, right? That whole sort of the cliche of the river that is always moving, right? It's a cliche now. It was an awesome insight early on, and Heraclitus is one of my favorite early pyromaniacs. You know, he's obsessed with fire and all of that, and brilliant aphoristic philosopher. But nevertheless, he believes that existence is in a state of continual flux. Could we imagine a force then, or a definition of evil as that which can stop the unstoppable? Right. So that's one of the things, the ability to arrest things, to paralyze them. When they cite the king in all his power, line 5, evil has the sensorial force of the aura. Now, if prophets have halos, right, and they emit a kind of radiance, does evil also have its own dark radiance or dark awe? And what is the criterion of that? What is it related to? How does it emit? How do they summon it? And what is the effect? And how does it differ from when, let's say, a Christ-like Messiah wanders through the street, sort of basking in light? So again, in the Islamic tradition, I know some of you heard me teach this before or say this before. In the Islamic tradition, all of the angels of God are created from sunlight, with the exception of Satan, who is created from moonlight, which is a fascinating distinction to be made. So let's consider what that would mean, the dark aura or the dark awe of evil. We go, oops, sorry, where am I? There we are. The king is, or I'm sorry, when they cite the king in all his power, the God who feeds on his mother eats his mother, or feeds on his father eats his mother. So this is an obvious one. Evil strikes against its origin. Now there's two ways to go against something. You can be anti-genetic, which means almost like the avant-garde who wanted to burn down museums and libraries of the past, right? You can sort of strike against, sort of Cain does this, rebel against the architect or the progenitor of things. But you can also do it by becoming cryptogenetic, which is to say, can you dissociate yourself? Can you alienate yourself so extravagantly from your point of origin that it no longer has any trace residual connections, thus making you essentially beginningless? And that is a process of stylistic self-reformation, in a sense, right? Almost like the Joker who decides to erase his identity through the simulation of a clown's paint, you know, sort of, and makeup. It's a cosmetic gesture above all else. It is crucial for you all to know this, that the greatest mad turns of characters in the history of literature. So if you even take the first novel supposedly in the Western canon, Miguel de Cervantes' Don Quixote, right? So he's a kind of mid-level aristocrat at the sort of old age of his life, and he's reading these texts about knights in Spain, and he's brooding and reading and immersing himself until he decides, there's this breaking point where he decides, this is hyperstition 1,000 years before it's invented, he decides to become one of those knights. Only problem is there haven't been knights in Spain for hundreds of years. It's an anachronism, right? It's a sort of arcane vestige that no longer exists. But how does he become that? It's not at any ontological depth or psychological. He decorates himself in the articles and implements of knights. He goes and finds his grandfather's sword, right? It's all rusted and sort of battered, but he retrieves it. He extracts all kinds of things from that epocality and basically drapes himself in costumes. It's entirely what great tribal traditions understood in their ritual totem sort of performances before war, putting makeup on the face, placing eyeliner sort of under the eyes, dressing as wolves or as other creatures and animals in the furs, you know, of other things, painting yourself in war paint. It's entirely surface. It's at the level of appearances. This is something that if I could resurrect Plato, I could never get him to understand or want to want to believe. But trust me, it's all at the level of the surface and of the appearances. So similarly, it's well known in the Christian tradition that when the devil falls from grace, falls from heaven, he becomes instantaneously ugly. Now that's an intriguing thing, that the very first consequence of his expulsion is the loss of his appearance, or the malformation of appearance, right? That's an interesting thing. In fact, this is a great thing to know. There is almost no indication that anything ontologically has shifted. He doesn't lose his intelligence. He doesn't lose his cunning. He doesn't lose his knowledge of the universe. None of that is stripped as punishment, only his appearance. And remember that Lucifer, by definition, was the one who resembled God the most, looked like God. So this is very important, because in many narrative traditions of demons or of devils, they're often highly stylistically alluring. They dress well, they speak well, they move well. And so this is something just to be aware of when we're talking about that dark aura, and also how to become cryptogenetic in that regard. Okay, his glory is in this, or wait a minute, the king is such a tower. Where are we at? Inciting the God who feeds on the king is such a tower of wisdom, even his mother can't discern his name. Okay, evil possesses its own paradigm of counterverticality, the tower. This is going to be important, because we thought that we had to abandon, because verticality was so associated with political power historically, the kings, the emperors, and all of that, but also with metaphysical power, the God in the sky. It's become very fashionable for us to want to abandon verticality altogether and just become purely horizontal. So Jackson Pollock does it with, his splatter paints, and Deleuze and Guattari sort of fling us and unleash us to the world of rhizomatic horizontality. That's cool. But I like to sometimes go back and salvage old, wretchedly reactionary or authoritarian principles and see if you can twist them in ways that they can actually be modified in intriguing fashion. So to suggest that evil, rather than abandon verticality, it'd be very easy for us to say evil is horizontal. That's fun. And yes, it can be. But can evil also have its own paradigm of counter-verticality, right? And that's where you get into, that's why you need storytelling and not philosophy. You need elevator shafts, you need mine shafts, you need trap doors, you need subterranean tunnels where snakes dwell. These are the things, right? You need nether universes. So there are forms of verticality that are not inscribed necessarily. Hell is problematic because it's in a dialectic, sort of, obviously that's part of that. But we can have many other things that we can get into, right? So if you get into the evil, not absolute evil like the devil, but like kind of micro evils like the jinn in Islamic tradition, these small, strange, microscopic fairy creatures. If you go to stories of magical lamps, right, which have now become somewhat Orientalist cliches, but they're actually part of the narrative traditions of the so-called Middle East. So if you go to those stories of the magic lamps that produce genies who grant you 3 wishes, right? They're almost always found in undergrounds or caves, in some secluded vertical sub-layer. And that's very important to think of layers, and even this is where Deleuze and Guattari, people miss this. They loved stones, and they loved geological stone formations, which are all vertical, right? So, I mean, they're horizontal as well, but they're vertically arranged. If we think of it geologically, why that's important is because the first seminar I ever taught for the New Center was on deception. Some of you were there with me. And one of the first formulations of being a good liar is the ability to layer, right? Is to create layers of the lie, right? Folds, which Deleuze and Guattari are obsessed with, are a different typology. Layers are something slightly different that we're going to get into here. Evil works in layers. It layers time. So that's where a demon shows up to Andrew and says, I'll give you whatever you want now, and in 30 years, I'll come to collect your soul. That's a layering of time, right? That's a vertical stratification of time, right? They also do that with space. They also do that with identity, which is really interesting. Because the second that the demon shows up and says, I know who you really are, there's the suggestion there of a layer. And actually what I want to say, that we'll talk about that when you get to line 14, where I prove it's even in this ancient Egyptian text that evil has subterranean dimensions. Oops. I don't want you to think that I mean that it's the transcendent hiddenness of God, or that I'm referring to the unconscious. One of the greatest principles of evil that we will come to is that evil does not repress. There is no repression and there is no neurosis in evil. Right? One of the, actually a pretty stunning performance. If all of you have seen Javier Bardem in No Country for Old Men, right? A figure of radical neutrality, of pure calmness, mostly throughout the film. He just sort of almost has some of those, a little bit of a more personified human dimension of those 1980s monsters like Jason and Friday the 13th, or the Halloween guy Michael Myers, who just stalk, right? But there's no perceived emotional flux, neither sadistic delight going on there, nor flagrancy of rage, just kind of the radical calmness. If you go watch that film again, you'll hear when remember, he flips a coin every time he's about to kill someone. So he gives them an out that's tied to chance or accident or coincidence. And at one point, a woman pleads with him and says, you don't have to do it. It's not the coin, it's you, you know, that. And gave one of the best scripted lines philosophically that you could give. He said, the coin and I got here the same way, which is to fling himself to just the complete arbitrariness and absurdity of chance as well, not to hierarchically elevate himself as a knowing subject or a willing subject, but to say, listen, you caught some bad luck that this coin made its way to you. I'm just an accessory to that luck. I'm just an appendage to those winds that blow this way or that way. So there's no guilt or shame in my game or burden of moral complexes, right? You don't blame a tidal wave or a sandstorm. And so that's how he perceives himself in that regard. So we'll get to that though, but that precisely means there's nothing repressed going on there. But we'll get to all of that. So, and counter intellect. Remember that it says, even his mother, he's such a tower of wisdom. Now that's crucial. Tower of wisdom. What are we talking about? If we're not talking about the philosophical archetype of wisdom, which philosophers themselves don't agree upon, what kind of wisdom are we talking about? Right? Interestingly, I'll teach you this at some later point. Some of you may have heard me lecture at some point on the fact that in Islam, God has 99 names. And it's a very bizarre and awesome kind of schizoid sort of landscape of title. Their names are titles, and they're conceptual titles. They're conceptual persona. So you have the more standard benevolent ones, like the healer, the giver, the merciful, right? When you say the first line of the sort of Quranic prayer, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, you know, it's the all merciful, the all compassionate. Okay, those are given. Then there are some more strange neutral ones, like the opener of gates, the watcher. Okay, these are neither, but then there are some evil ones mixed in there. The humiliator, the defamer, the afflictor, al-mumit, the death bringer, right? And even the one that they don't like to mention, al-makir, which means the deceiver. Now, the way that it's been translated in contemporary mainstream Islam, it wasn't a big deal in medieval Arabia because deception was a part of warfare. Go read the Odyssey, you know, or go read, you know, Odysseus is famous. He's not a moral warrior. He's the Trojan horse guy who slits people's throats in the middle of the night while they're sleeping, right? The hero in the ancient world was defined not as a morally superior being. Hercules and Achilles are horrible individuals, absolutely morally horrible. Hercules strangles and kills his own newborn child and wife. You know, they're winners. They're simply the figures who have prevailed. That is what makes them sort of the heroic figure. And so is Odysseus. So is it a bad thing in medieval tribal Arabia of constant conflict and war over resources to speak of God as the deceiver, which literally means the layer of traps, of ambushes? That's the etymological. Al-makir means like someone who can lay traps and ambushes and catch people by surprise. That's a compliment in medieval Arabia. Today, it sounds like a moral failure. So they have translated it as the planner. He makes plans, right? I would compromise. I'm willing to bargain with the Islamic clerics and settle on the plotter. If they were willing to do that, because plot has a slightly more devious kind of etymological capacity, but that's okay. They don't ask me my opinion on this, so I just say my heresies at the New Center. All right, we go back to this. So what counter intellect? Reza, my dear friend Reza Negarestani, is really into the idea of cunning and its relationship to demonology, and he definitely is interested in the question of intelligence and also how evil possesses its own criterion of intelligence. We will actually go to try and define that ourselves as well. When he studies things like artificial intelligence, he's interested in machinic properties of intelligence, the ability, sort of computational sort of things. Also, if you remember, machines are excellent at counterfeiting and replicating. So the printing press replicates. So if we think of that as an evil propensity, the ability to replicate, the ability to, that's one possibility. But then there are others that we'll look at, because it's not just about machines and all of that. We'll look at sort of the types of intelligences. But you have to, intelligence here, if we think of insights, for instance, what do ghosts know that we don't? I mean, just in the, I mean, I don't mean actually, I mean in the storytelling, but even if we took it, by the way, in the Freudian psychoanalytic, most material, scientific, banal definition of ghostliness, according to Freud, is simply the external projection of internal trauma onto an apparitional figure. So it's a hallucination, it's a psychosomatic hallucination, essentially, because whatever is eating away at you on the inside, you don't want inside you anymore. So it's better to just fling it outside in some even terrifying spectral vision. It's still better than keeping that sort of harbored and devouring sort of your innards, in a sense. So even if we took that Freudian idea of a kind of projection of a wish or a fear of some kind onto an external thing, still that ghost then knows certain things about the unconscious that you don't know, because they're an embodiment of the repressed, uncanny kind of domain of a buried secret. Okay, let's not go in that direction, but let's just say ghosts have superior wisdom. That's why we're intimidated. They have seen something. They've seen the other side, maybe, or the lack of the other side. But they also know things about the trajectory. They know things about the chain of events, typically because they're victims of sequentiality. Things went wrong for them. Circumstances convened in a way that led to a violent conclusion. Ghosts almost always die badly, right, by unnatural or violent force. Therefore, they are students, they're obsessive students of the chain of incidents. So does that make them highly acutely aware of your own trajectivities, to use a term that Paul Virilio uses? You could say trajectology, if you want to make it a study of trajectories. Do they see arcs? Yes. They can, and their ability to, part of their ethereality, their ability to walk through walls, their ability to hover and levitate, their ability to disappear through ceilings or floors, may be precisely linked to their ability to manipulate arcs, right? So if you notice that in haunted house stories, a nice family in the suburbs buys some house, they don't know it's a damned house, they don't know there are ghosts in the walls and all of that. They have a certain vision of futurity, a certain destiny that they presume that is then radically altered by the ghosts. So the ghosts are interruptive figures. But The interruption doesn't work unless you know where someone is going already. You follow? So there must be a predictive, anticipatory intelligence there, right? The ghost must know what your life would have looked like if they had not entered, and how things would have unfolded. That's the best way to be able to then deflect someone or throw someone into divergence, if that makes sense, right? Okay. Line 8, we're still on line 8. The king is such a tower of wisdom, even his mother can't discern his name. Oof. Evil suspends identity and knowing in ambiguity. Okay, that's easy enough, but let's get into how do you do that? How do you make someone who knew you once not know you anymore? Your own mother, right? By the way, there's a very subtle evil moment in the New Testament, in the Gospels, where Christ meets his mother, Mary, on the road. She approaches him and says, "My son," and he says, "I don't know you, woman. I don't have a mother. You're mistaken. I only have a father." Ooh, that is mean-spirited and malicious, and for the sake of his orthodoxy, yes, he has no mother figure. But what that means, he's been traveling for a while, and he's able to gain enough distance somehow that he can deny or renounce the mother. And that's a really strange and powerful thing, because supposedly one of the only people who's there watching from his entourage at the crucifixion is his mother. And she's paying the price existentially. She's grieving as her son is slung up on the cross like a side of veal. She is emitting awful wailing cries. And he just a few months ago said, "I don't know you." Right? Okay, there's a trace of something. So if the good can do that, if we call that the good, evil can do that too. How do you do that? How do you do that? Well, concealment is an obvious one. That's one thing. You can hide things from people so they don't know what they are. Incognito is another one. You can disguise them, right? So that they look like one thing but are another. And that's one of the oldest and most simple formulations of evil is the wolf in sheep's clothing narrative, right? I don't love that, even though we will look into that. We'll definitely look into that. I don't love it. There was a movie from the 1980s with Mickey Rourke and Robert De Niro. De Niro played the devil, right? And he was a lawyer. He's like some slick, corrupt lawyer who meets Mickey Rourke's character. And his name on his card is Lou Cipher. Like, you have to be an idiot not to be able to figure that out, right? That his name is Louis Cipher or Lou Cipher. And then at the end, it's this big reveal and a revelation. Oh my God. So, but if you look carefully enough, the clues are all there in very flagrant transparency, meaning I don't think that a devil, it's just we don't want to see, or we don't want to know. That's a difference. That's a crucial difference. Next is, sorry, a creature. Next, we have the idea of anonymity. Going without a name is one way that you can do things. And lastly, this is the one that I really want us to. This is one that I really want us to concentrate on. Derangement. It may not be in this poem. It may not be that the mother can't discern his name because the king hides his name or goes by another name or obfuscates the name. It may be the fact that she can't discern his name because he has spellbound the mother or distorted the waves of consciousness of the mother, thrown her into derangement, right? And that's definitely something for us to explore. The ability to confuse others, the ability to distract others. Evil is also often related to distraction, right? And so we'll get into all of that. But that's the thing, can evil drive someone temporarily mad? You know, by the way, ancient literatures are often it's described as rage, or it's described as like Bacchic entrancement. But if you look at ancient mythologies and ancient legends, there are often these lapses of temporary insanity. And they're almost always associated with kind of dark, queasy forces. Dionysus is kind of the god that no one wants to hang out with. Everyone wants to hang out, but no one wants to really spend too much time with. And so there are these moments, again, these lapses of ambiguity. In contemporary psychoanalytic terminology, we call this dissociative or psychogenic fugue states. The person who's found walking on the highway for 2 weeks, and the police collect them and say, where are you from, and what, and they either are suffering from anterograde amnesia or retrograde amnesia, which means either they remember everything up to those last 2 weeks, they don't remember any of the strange things they did, the hitchhiking to Las Vegas, the pleasure seeking and destructive behavioral patterns. Those are a blur, but they remember who they are and where they come from and their family and all of that. Or the exact opposite, they only remember the last 2 weeks. So even their own brothers and sisters are brought before them, and they have no knowledge of them. Now, the interesting question for you to say that is that which psychogenic fugue states result in the restoration of memory, and which ones will they never remember? It's really interesting to note, depending on the exact events that have transpired and the way that the story unfolds, it like a light switch, sometimes they come back, sometimes they never gain their memory or their recollections. So we'll look to that though. Next, his glory is in the sky, his strength lies in the horizon, like that of his father, the sun god. Okay, we get this. Evil has its own conception of glory. And this is the weird one. It follows almost the logic of the martyr, post-mortem destinies. Are there certain forms of glory that are only gained on the other side of death? Right? Now, that also is partially the narrative of the good, because you have to die, you have to check out in order to have access to the afterlife and the eternal. That's part of the idealistic segmentation of the material world and then the eternal, the idealized eternal. Sure, the good plays at that game too, but I want us to think about this in relationship to material continuation. So the vampire who has to die in order to become immortal continues to dwell in this plane, in this universe, in this world, right? And that's a really interesting thing, because they're also defined, if you go back to early Transylvanian folkloric accounts of the vampire, they are hypersensorial. So one thing that's often lost in the modern filmmaking, because this would be obscene, is that supposedly the vampire walks around in a state of perpetual erotic arousal, just so you know. Also, the bite was always, I know some of you heard me say this before, was always narratively characterized as ecstatic, never as painful, right? But as almost unbearable level of pleasure. But this idea that you can only, and then of course they're driven by thirst, insatiable thirst, right? So they become hypersensorial, hypermaterial after they die in this world, which allows them a kind of return, whereas no one returns from the eternal, right? The mummy does this, the zombie does this, right? So we can, and even the cat does this with their 9 lives. You know, there's often an incorrect understanding of the cat as a survivor, but there's the ancient idea of the folkloric idea of the cat having 9 lives, is that the cat dies, actually dies, but then quickly, instantaneously flips into its next chamber of life. You follow? That's why it's 9 lives. It's not the cat can't die. But that's how we, in our modern, unnuanced kind of way, understand it, right? Because modernity is synonymous with a ridiculous and pathetic fear of death. Just ask any philosopher. That's one of the few things they all agree upon, that modern subjectivity is more allergic to death than any time period, any epocality in history, right? So, and the strange, ironic, tragically ironic consequence of that historically is genocide. because genocidal events are overcompensatory mechanisms for the suppression of death. When you try to create utopias where no one will ever die anymore, you kill a lot of people. It's a nice pendulum swing, right? But at any rate, we don't have to get into the political universe here, because I disqualify the political, by the way, because it's never evil enough for me. It's not even evil, it's toxically good, meaning it's predicated upon logics of the good, which are cancerous at their essence. So we'll continue here. Its own conception of glory that usually has to go through some terrible prism. By the way, this is also part of hero journey archetypes too in historical storytelling. So usually the hero has to go through awful tribulations and suffering. It's not death, but it's as close as you can come to death. They have to brush up against death. They have to have near-death experiences. Interestingly, I've written about this. Shamans of the black in Mongolia, dark shamans, the way they are selected, the way you're selected to be a dark shaman, which Genghis Khan used to bring a contingency of dark shamans with him, shamans of the black, to every war that he fought, and he won every war, was that you have to have a near-death experience either through illness, so some like spiked fever, typhoid fever, something that nearly kills you when you're young, or you're struck by lightning or attacked by animals or something to that effect. You have to almost die as a child. And it's an intriguing sort of notion. The idea that Atum is the father god, but then the dead king is even greater, that's a principle of supersession, right? So interestingly, if Pierre Klosowski, who's a genius of the 20th century in his own right, if Klosowski was obsessed with Nietzsche's eternal return, to the extent that he wrote a very brilliant book called The Vicious Circle that I would recommend. His writings on Nietzsche there, I think, are even far more complex than Deleuze's or Bataille's in The Vicious Circle. Bataille's are beautiful, but this book really gets into Nietzsche's insistence on return and recurrence and all of that. But what if we created an alternative geometry of the spiral? So this is what happens. But notice it's only the dead king. The king is not greater than God. That would be pure narcissistic politics, right? And we've had enough of that these days, and in the US the last 4 years before and continuing. So we don't need that. We don't need sort of the egomania of or egocentrism. That's not this. Only the dead king attains the gift of supersession, which is the spiral. And we'll figure out why in a moment. If you know anything about ancient Egyptian mythology, the first gods of the universe, there's this chaos god who's kind of a just complete force. It's not humanized or mythologized as a figure of any kind. It has 4 pairings of children who are like water, infinity, death, and I forget exactly what they are. I remember I wrote them on my book on Night, but they're men and women. They're kind of these dyads, men and women, that the women, I believe, have serpent heads and the men have frog heads. Okay, so they're these hybrid creatures. But what's really fascinating, I don't remember exactly, but they give rise to the first elemental essential properties of creation, but then they die. This is amazing to me. The first gods, they have to die in order for the next gods to come. And so they have this kind of sacrificial instinct that they know that once they have done their share or their business in the transaction, that they have to evacuate the scene, which is precisely so much more brilliant than the Greek mythology of Kronos, who is a typical authoritarian king figure who, in his paranoia and his egomania, must eat his children and offspring in order to keep his throne, right? That shows the worst elements of human personality. But these 8 gods, these men, women cohorts that say, okay, now our time is over. That's a certain relationality that is fascinating. And by the way, if you ask me, are those gods considered good or evil in the Egyptian tradition? those forerunner gods, that's a really interesting one, because right after them, when Horus and others come about, we get this sudden formation of good and evil in the Egyptian pantheon. We get the benevolent god heroes, and then we get Set and his crews who are tricksters and liars and deceivers and all of that. Those gods, though, unclassifiable. They're neither worshipped or beheld as purely good in any way, nor are they considered evil. They're strange with their frog and snake heads. They're kind of just looked upon as figures of original necessity. And that's a really interesting question too, necessity. Since we started with the idea that storytelling is never necessary, only bad forms of storytelling presume to be necessary. Instead, they're indulgent, they're excessive, they're idle, right? They're a symptom of sort of laziness in the universe, or just a windfall or good fortune of having time to kill. Notice the violence in that expression. But this is an interesting one. Does evil ever feel that something is necessary? Malcolm X said, by any means necessary. And he was insinuating political violence when he was saying that. We'll see whether or not there is any underlying conception of necessity at a given point, right? Definitely, if we watch the film The Lighthouse later this semester, which is one of the ones that we will look at, you will see that the light keeper is driven by a concept of ritual necessity. He must sort of bring the light every night, but it's not necessity in the moral sense of so that the ships don't crash because it's my job. It's a different, more perverse concept of necessity, which is also more interesting and less fascistic. Remember, I'm just following orders is the hallmark of fascism and fascist necessity, bureaucratic necessity. That's the most awful thing we've seen in our modern era. And so that idea of saying it's more perverse might mean it's more liberating and less fascistic a concept of necessity than that metallic ideological idea of gotta go to work, right? Let's go to the next thing. What am I gonna say? This is a very interesting one. His vital spirits surround him. His qualities lie below his feet. He is cloaked in gods and cobras coil on his forehead. Okay, so that gives us a few things here. First, he is surrounded by vital spirits. Okay, well, vital, it means living, and spirits usually means dead. And I like this. It means you confuse the living with the dead. Right? So one of the original hierarchies and one of the original distinctions of the universe is obsolesced by evil, because evil has necromantic abilities and talents. Now, this is something I want you to know at times. The devil is the one who brings things back from the dead, but God does that too. God has the power of resurrection. And this is going to be an interesting thing when we notice shared gifts or shared powers. Right? If you notice in every horror movie, why is the horror genre in the history of American cinema the first one to experiment with seriality? You know, Friday the 13th, 1, 2, 3, 4, Nightmare on Elm Street, 1, 2, 3, 4. You know, again, if you look at other genres, it was intolerable to allow seriality in drama or in anything other than horror up until now, where everybody's just serial obsessed, and there's 9 Twilights and 6 Harry Potters and a million, Avengers and all of that. But if you look at it, even when The Godfather went for the 3rd round, people thought it was a disgusting kind of depreciation, right? Never mind, we're up to 6, 7, 8 now in our filmmaking. But horror was always allowed this from the beginning because it's established. It's an established fundamental principle of the evil character that they'll come back. that whatever force they're tapping into, forget devils and all that, whatever reservoir of power that they are accessing allows a resurrection. But so does Jesus when he brings Lazarus out of the cave. And by the way, there is absolutely no indication of any moral value of resurrecting Lazarus from the cave, other than that it's a miraculous spectacle. Like, God doesn't command, like, this was a good guy, he shouldn't have died. First of all, what does it mean to say he shouldn't have died? Then that means there's a kind of flaw in creation, in God's plans, in God's tabulation of things, right? But why this reversal? Why bring him out of the cave? Right? It's and by the way, filmic, this is amazing. If you look at cinematic depictions of Lazarus coming out of the cave, I love this. I've seen about 7, I don't know why, but I've seen 7 instances where it's scenically depicted. He is never happy. He's never excited. He staggers out in disbelief and almost like a Butoh dancer in some type of primordial ooze, unfamiliarity and disorientation. Right? It's not a great, and then of course everybody thanks Jesus and he goes on his way. But Lazarus himself is stranded in incomprehensibility and in the vertigo of having traversed the living and the dead domains, right? So what that tells you is resurrection principles, and Jesus does this too. Remember when, I believe is it Mary or Mary Magdalene who sees Christ on the 3rd day? Is it Mary Magdalene who sees Christ on the 3rd day, right? She's also stunned and shocked. But in the domain of evil, nobody's surprised when Freddy Krueger comes back or when the ghost returns, right? Which tells you there's a much more fluid, there's a greater perceptual fluidity for return and resurrection in evil. So even if it is the same shared gift, the sensitivity to it is different, right? Evil has its, we said that qualities lie below his feet. Evil has its own subterranean dimensions. Evil cloaks itself in disguises or occultations. The word occult comes from like occultation, which is to place something in a kind of barricaded enclosure of some kind, but also turns living or breathing entities into ornamental pieces. So he says his head is, where is it? He's cloaked in gods and cobras coil on his forehead, right? If you think imaginatively to depictions of evil figures who sit on thrones, like evil rulers, they almost always have like some beast that's like adorning them, right? So you think of the James Bond character, evil villain who has the cat in his lap that he's sort of caressing. You can picture in Conan, our Arnold Schwarzenegger's Conan the Barbarian, the evil figure has a snake draped around his neck that's coiling, you know, sort of, and all of that. This is, we have to get into why this is a sort of a consistent storytelling mechanism. That evil drapes itself ornamentally in living things, you know. It's a really interesting, even Dante in the Inferno pictures Satan as eating things in his mouth, constantly eating people, chewing on people, masticating on fallen, condemned subjects. But the idea of dressing themselves with them, Sedna in the Arctic Inuit tradition, she is the head of the Inuit pantheon. So, but in common vernacular, what you would call Eskimos. But and she's a sea and ice goddess. She, by the way, very similar to this, becomes that by eating her mother and father. Now her mother and father remain alive, but they're so horrified by her that they become, by her wrath and her viciousness, that she would cook and eat them and amputate their limbs, that they become subordinated to her. Now, the really interesting thing there, when we talk about subterranean, is we could read that mythology and it would be identical in many ways to these principles. Her palace is at the bottom of the ocean, and she decorates her palace with the curtains of her palace are the clothes of people shipwrecked, drowned at sea. So for a seafaring culture that is constantly fishing and all of that, many people have drowned over time. She collects their And she also, the scaffolding of her palace are the bones of those who have drowned at sea. So what does it mean to wear sort of ornamental piece of the other? In war, this was an ancient custom you would wear the sort of the skull cap of a fallen enemy, but when they're dead, not when they're alive and twitching and writhing. So evil takes it to a next kind of more acidic level in that regard. Those cobras that are coiling on the forehead of the dead king, they're called guiding snakes, which tells us evil uses strange orienting mechanisms. And that's going to be interesting for us when we think of how evil has always been associated to some extent with map making as well. So when we say plotting, that's a cartographic, more than it is an intellectual, it's a cartographic one. It's trying to think in space, sort of almost like game theory. If A happens, then B will happen. If B happens, you create trees, sort of a possibility. But the idea that guiding snakes, that's going to be really interesting, because when we think of communications between evil figures, so now when we have multiple evil players who are in consort with one another, who are in conspiracy with one another, how do they communicate? How do they orient one another? How do the assassins of Hassan as-Sabah in the medieval Persian tradition let one another know that one is in town, right? What are the traces? And often it's a really interesting thing. One of the ways that they would do this, I think I taught everybody in another seminar, that they often use scent. They often would use aromas as indicators, because it's the most overlooked sense of the five senses. You're always listening for, like, government authorities are always eavesdropping for, communicative messages, or they're watching for gestures and signs. They're not smelling things, right? To this day, secret police don't use that, in case you ever want to engage in espionage. But the second reason for or thing that they would do that I've never told anyone is that they often would embed their clues in pattern formations. So things like if there was a lattice of an arabesque, like the Islamic kind of geometrical designs and all of that, they would put a striation in one of those, or in trees, in leaf patterns. They would hide things. And the interesting thing is, you would think, wouldn't that stand out? Only if you're looking for it, right? Otherwise, it's actually psychologically demonstrated that we would not. Hunters know how to do this. You and I, we would all walk through a forest. We would not notice the unsettled nature of a leaf pattern. But that's precisely how they track, right? Is to look at minor disturbances in things. So evil uses strange orienting mechanisms. This is going to be a really important one. Evil can enter other beings. So when he says they peer into souls, we know this in our most intuitive associations with evil. We understand the principle of possession. Right? We've seen enough exorcist movies. We know enough demonology, even if you just caught it third hand, to know that possession. But this is something that we really have to unravel, because Jesus, again, also does this. Also can read minds, can read souls. And the Last Supper is a gesture of possession. Eat my body, drink my blood, almost vampiric level transfusion of the divine into the bloodstreams of the disciples, right? What's different in evil then? When evil possesses? When it's said that, well, if you ask the priesthood, that the four gospels are written between 25 to 100 years, 150 years after the death of Christ, none of whom were actual historical witnesses, none of whom actually even spoke the language of Christ, the Aramaic dialect that he was in. So what's the insinuation, or what's the excuse or rationale? Divine inspiration. Inspire, again from the Greek inspiros, to breathe into. Don't worry, they're guided by God's ability to breathe the truth into them, which is an invasive, intrusive property. Well, if that's what God does when he inspires a prophet or inspires an author, what would the evil sort of counter version of that be? That's interesting for us to look at, right? And we can look at different forms of possession and all of that. That's going to be something that Rimbaud will take us into very quickly. Claims this, we're going to end this soon. And we're even just on the first column, but that's fine. They're ready to spit fire against his enemies. Okay, this teaches us a lot of things really quickly. First is that evil can project itself as a weapon, spitting, right? Again, you've seen The Exorcist. The most famous and legendary scene is the vomiting scene, right? So these gestures of self-expulsion onto others, to coat others in that sort of something that disturbs us about snakes, which are always linked to evil, is that they often spit venom. They don't just bite with venom, they spit venom as well, right? In certain instances. And also that they use strange things, like they use their tongue in order to smell. These are interesting things that upset our coordinates of bodily experience. But turning elemental properties into weapons. So it says here that they spit fire, right? That's interesting. There are going to be two, well, they're actually going to be three, let's say, three categories of how evil embeds itself, sort of, or how evil manifests. And just follow me on this, and I mean this at a visual level again. Either the evil figure is hyper stylized, elegant, graceful, powerful in their strides, everything about their choreography and their again, their fashion sense is just fascinating and astonishing. But for that, there has to be already a concept of beauty, a pre-existing concept of beauty that they uphold and exaggerate to some maximal level, right? That's what the vampire is to some extent. Even. Vampires are more beautiful than the human, but on human terms for the most part, right? But then there's a second possibility, which is, well, evil can also be the most hideous, right? The most ugly, the most abject, the most wretched looking, the most monstrous. We get that. So there's actually four categories. The one that's also going to be interesting is the evil that goes unnoticed. The guy in the diner eating soup that nobody knows is the devil. And actually, that's one of the lessons of Al Pacino's character to Keanu Reeves, that hero of American cinema, Keanu Reeves, in the slight sarcasm there, poor guy. At least he chooses some good films. But anyway, where in The Devil's Advocate, he tells Keanu Reeves, Al Pacino, who's Satan incarnate, tells Keanu Reeves' character, the one thing you're missing, the one thing you don't have in your game or your arsenal is you don't have the element of surprise. They always see you coming from a mile away. You're flashy, you're gaudy, you're macho. They see that. He goes, me, I'm a surprise, right? So nobody looks at me on the subway. No one looks twice. That is not often evil is precisely that which you can't take your eyes off of, has an irresistible quality, either positively or negatively, either because it's monstrous or it's just seductively, again, in The Lighthouse, you'll see it with the light, just can't take your eyes off the light. We have this other possibility too, that evil is precisely that which can disguise itself as the most ordinary, the most banal, the most mundane, right? The everyday person. So evil in its everydayness is something that we can look at. And then there was a fourth category. Oh, evil as just purely strange. Again, the frog-headed and first women gods. There's no taxonomy for that, right? It's neither ugly nor beautiful. It's just weird, visually weird, and unrecognizable. That's the fourth that we'll consider. And that evil always has a certain orientation towards the enemy and can convene others against its enemy. So in the dialectical devil-God thing, obviously God becomes the ultimate enemy. But then it's more interesting for us to sometimes think about when in stories of the jinn, when you become the enemy, meaning when the jinn target you, and they're able to bring all their collaborative forces, the forest, the lightning, the stones, rain, against you, right? They can convene and summon them against you. That's something interesting for us to consider. Line 19, the king's head is on his torso. I just wanted to notice that. Samuel Beckett once said something to the effect of, in my writing, my job is to make the eye turn into an ear, the ear turn into a nose, the nose turn into a mouth. So it's a Mr. Potato Head kind of theory of transplantation, right? And of switching of organs. Beckett saw that as one of the greatest creative talents of literature, when it can do that. And he didn't mean it just literally in the sense of someone walking around with a nose in their ear. Could you actually create that synesthetic capacity in writing or in plays? Synesthesia being the confusion of senses or the swapping of senses. Can you actually hear colors? Right? Proust tries very, very hard, and he gets tons of credit for this, maybe rightfully so, with his concept of kind of the involuntary memory that is brought by nostalgia. For instance, a certain smell triggers a memory of some kind, or the taste of a cookie reminds him of the grandmother. So these associations, sort of where taste can become visual, where visual can become auditory. This is something that is a relationship to the body that evil has, and to sensation, and is referred to as a bull. Evil has multiple relations to animality, here specifically referred to as the bull. You guys may know that two of the most evil gods in Babylonian, Carthaginian, Canaanite history are Moloch and Baal, right? So Moloch is the one of child sacrifice that's condemned in the Old Testament, but Baal is the one that when the Jews of Moses decide to betray God because they've become impatient in the desert for 40 years, they turn to the idol Baal, who is a pre-existing bull god as well. And they create the golden bull statue in his honor. So why is the bull related to that? But by the way, you can see the bull in Persepolis, colossal bull's head. You have the Apis bull cult of the ancient world. There's a lot of bull figures that you can get into, as well as the Minotaur in Greek and North African mythologies. Cool. All right, we can get into these other ones later. That evil has its own definition of conquest or defeat, because he mentions vanquishing. Evil is devouring apparatus, mutilation, cannibalism, magical banquet. That's the one I really want to get into. There are 2 or 3 occasions in this poem that reference banquets or feasts. And that's a really interesting one, because again, the jinn in genie, i.e. genies in the Arabian tradition, they're famous for their weddings and their feasts. And if you ever stumble upon a jinn marriage, a jinn wedding, be careful, because it's all the greatest foods of existence. It's pure delicacy and luxury and indulgence. But there's always a price for your intrusion or your invitation to the party of the jinn, right? And if you want to know how you can recognize that you're at a jinn wedding, which, by the way, my wife's great-grandfather claimed that he attended one. It's a nice fable of their storyline, that one night he was sent to, he's actually sent to retrieve opium for guests. Opium was not illegal in the early 1900s at that point. So there were guests, and he was going by an abandoned castle in the hillsides there, and he heard noise and music, which was strange in the middle of the night. So he went there on horseback, and he found a huge wedding going on. This is a story that they tell, that he told supposedly in great fear. Anyway, he did something wrong at the jinn wedding, and the whole thing disappeared and vanished before his eyes while he was eating there. But the way that he was able to understand later, and someone in the town later explained to him that it was a jinn wedding that he had stumbled upon, was that the groom and bride were too beautiful. They were superhumanly attractive. And that's an interesting thing just for us to get into again. But these magical banquets, these feasts of the jinn, Satyrs in the Greek tradition, those half goat, half human flute playing creatures of the forest, creatures of kind of orgiastic excursions and music and wine and pleasure principles. Think about banquets, we'll talk about that. Evil has its own designated spatiality, architectonics, zones. So when he mentions that the gods bloat themselves with magic on the island of fire, to note that there are certain isles that are evil isles, evil sectors, evil quadrants or compartments of the world. That's a really interesting notion, right? There are certain nightclubs that belong to the evil ones. Okay, so we understand this when we break down evil to a lower level of, let's say, like mafia or criminality, right? So criminality, precisely one of the first things that criminals do is they isolate their own private exclusive sectors of gathering, right? Criminal bars, criminal pool halls, criminal undergrounds, black markets, right? So that's part of the territoriality. So if we expand it more generally to the question of evil, then this allows us to contemplate this. And I was telling this to Nicholas before the class even began. When we get into the storytelling dimensions of things, absolutely, first thing that we want to note are the spaces of evil. Before we even get to the figures of evil and the objects of evil, right? That I talk about the spaces of evil, because evil in the garden is different than evil in the desert, right? Evil in the desert is different than evil in the mountain or the forest or the maze or the prison or wherever we're going to go, right, with this. So if you notice all four of the films that we're going to watch, so if you take Antichrist, it happens in the forest. If you take The Lighthouse, it happens by the sea. If you take Midsummer, that film, it happens in the mountains. And The Assassination of Jesse James happens essentially in the desert, in the Wild West, right, in the Badlands. They have radically different morphologies of space, as well as figures, as well, that we'll get into, and objects and all of that. But that's the first thing we want to look at, how evil kind of can shapeshift depending on its setting and its atmosphere. Evil is vigilant. Part of what makes Kafka, and it's an interesting question of whether the Kafkaesque is a residue of evil or a touch of evil, right? I would say yes, in the best complementary form, that he taps into something which is a kind of evil perception, in the sense that evil watches when no one else is looking. Evil looks to things that everyone overlooks. So if you can imagine that there's a party of very significant, important adults who are talking business in, let's say, some New York City apartment, the devil walks in and notices the 8-year-old little girl in the corner who no one is talking to. The most likely person to have a conversation with the child would be the evil figure. Don't take this to stupid levels of the predatory figure, right? Of like the predatory human. That's human sadism. This is different. This is different, meaning that there's a certain luxury or again elitism in being the one who focuses or concentrates on what no one else will touch, or what has become is still unclaimed. So what's interesting there, if you look again at Kafka, I always say this just quickly, that there were these 4 American macho men writers of the 20th century who wanted to write the great novel. And that's okay, they were awesome figures in their own right. Steinbeck, Fitzgerald, Faulkner, and Hemingway, all 4 of them more or less suicided themselves. If you read their biographies, ended up in despair. But none of those 4 are the kings of modernism. The king of modernist literature is that skinny Czechoslovakian Jewish kid named Kafka, who didn't write the great novel. He wrote short stories, right? The sort of the overlooked, underrepresented genre of literature at the time, always considered kind of the ugly stepsister, because if you're great, you either write poetry or you write novels. You're either Dostoevsky or you're Dante. You don't write some 5-page little weird thing. But Kafka did that, and also not trying to get published, not trying to be famous in his time. But interesting thing, how does it begin? Metamorphosis is not the origin of his writing, but nevertheless, it's an early enough work that we can say he's the guy who watched a bug climb on his wall, the incidental, the unlooked upon, the off the radar phenomenon. And that's the breaking point to what we call modernist literature. That's a revolution in the history of storytelling and of thought. He just paid attention to what no one else would bother paying attention to. He was willing to test himself in insignificant layers, in the trivial. And that is something that evil has a certain eye for details in that regard. Almost imperceptible details, because they have no currency. And that's part of the alchemy and the trickery of evil, is to make things that are seemingly worthless become suddenly impactful. So part of your three wishes, Aladdin, is that you want to be the new sultan. But you're a gutter rat. You're a street kid. You're an alley cat. You're a beggar. You don't have the right to be the sultan, but he becomes the sultan. So evil has that alchemical ability to take what is the most discarded, what is the most worthless, and to raise it significantly, exponential levels, right? Evil manipulates appearances, can make you think that you're seeing something that you're not seeing, can play the imposter. Can evil impersonate God? That's a great one, by the way. Yeah, the devil can impersonate God. Go watch The Last Temptation of Christ by Scorsese in the 1980s. Willem Dafoe plays Jesus, Harvey Keitel plays Judas. It's a weird casting choice, but it works. Have any of you seen it? By the great Greek writer Katsantzakis. Jesus doesn't die on the cross. He gets talked out of it by an angel. He's up there, he's mortified, he's wounded. I'm spoiling it for you because if you haven't seen it since the 1980s, you're probably not going to see it. An angel, a little girl appears and says, God has tested you enough. You have done well. You can come down now. He doesn't want you to die. She sounds beautiful. She sounds peaceful. She sounds tranquil. She is the devil. Right? So evil can manipulate appearances, can inhabit the false apotheosis or the imposter kind of guise of something else. This is interesting. If the good is known for judgment, to the extent that Antonin Artaud, who wanted to create the theater of cruelty, speaking about evil spatialities, by the way, the theater of cruelty is a perfect example of this. He doesn't need all of Paris. He doesn't need the whole city. He needs one exceptional room, which someone who goes through the wrong door and falls into suddenly finds themselves in an interactive universe of high prices. Right? That's all you need. But this is an interesting thing. Artaud very famously had a piece called To Be Done with Judgment, okay, or The End of Judgment, depending on how you want to translate it. And he's rightfully accusing sort of the moral universe of the good with being too obsessed with judgment. We understand that. But evil also condemns things. It also has its own reckoning mechanism. It also collects, which is to say that it makes things fulfill their word or keep their word. That's why evil makes you sign a contract. But that is an alternative understanding of judgment, right? That's, even Lewis Carroll tells Alice at the beginning of Wonderland, there's only one law, always mean what you say and say what you mean. Otherwise, it's all yours. The devil says that too. I'll give you anything you want. You define, you design futurity and destiny. I have no say in this, but I will collect. I will make you keep your word. Right? That's an interesting notion. If we take a more neutral figure that is sometimes associated with evil, the history of famous boatmen and boatwomen in the afterworld, right? So Chiron and these figures who comes from Kerti, the Egyptian one, often they're these skeletal figures who row you to the other side. Remember, that's why the Greeks put the coins on the eyelids of the dead in order to pay the ferryman, right? So that's an interesting thing. The ferryman doesn't care what happens to you on the other side. That's entirely self-willed. You determined your aftermath. But there is a judgment in the assertion of a price of some kind. Secret alliances. Evil is great at making secret alliances. You know that moment in movies where somebody, like some evil figure, is in the alleyway and they confront you one-on-one and you think you've got a one-on-one shot of dominating them, and then they smile and like 17 other people come out from the wings. And you've seen this cinematically out of the dark margins of the scene. That's the secret alliances. Evil always has more. It's why we associate insects like cockroaches and rats with evil, because when we see one in our apartment, we know there's 1,000 more in the walls. Right? So that's something else. Even if we can't see them, we know they're there. Just on a temporal level, really interesting. Evil believes often that all time, meaning the entire thread of time, the entire ring of time that Heidegger would say from the archaic to the futural, can be ruptured by a singular minor temporality. A split second could undo universal time, right? A split second done right, with the right practitioner of evil, can topple the clockwork universe. And where that is here is, where does it say it? On this day when the oldest ones are slaughtered. This day, the specificity, the particularity of that one day where you've got a shot to upset the totality of time, right? That is always why evil has the advantage over good, because good needs to win every round to sustain itself. That's the problem of being the dominant. Evil needs one thorn in the side, one instant where the winds of fortune turn in its favor at the card table. It needs to win one hand, and it can, because of its contaminative effect, right? Its impurification, right? Remember, only a single drop of evil blood ruins the entire bloodstream, right? Ruins holy water. So being on the lookout for that window of opportunity, that opportunism, opportunistic radar in time, what will be the day, right? When gods can be eaten, right? When the kings can be overthrown. By the way, this is not a far cry from Marx's calculation of revolutionary time, right? That's a very, very careful and delicate balance that needs to be figured out. He just doesn't call it evil, he calls it history. But he knows there's a certain precipice or breaking point where suddenly we've got our shot. There's enough space, there's enough leniency, there's enough flexibility in the time continuum that we can overthrow the entire order of things on one night. And that is part of the, by the way, the rapture and delirium and ecstatic nature of revolutions as well, and riot crowds. Is that, are you kidding me? I've been in a riot crowd, 40 years of a dictator, and it's only one night, overnight, they can be overthrown. The statues are brought down, the windows of the municipal building are shattered, the main square is set on fire, and the entire symbolic authority, you know, sort of is that they're hanged in effigy. It's an amazing thing. It's that instantaneity of a single instant. And then we can get into others. All right. So now that we'll stop there for now. And what I want to do at this stage is, because evil has been so, this is your part now, because evil has been so overdetermined in the history of discourse, right? So religion, the theology, as well as just general morality, has so overdefined it. I think the best way for us to approach, and this will be fun for the next 20 minutes or half an hour, is I would like each of you to formulate a question about evil. Not an answer, not a definition, not a principle yet, but in the very nature of the question, you're asserting the possibility of a bridge of an idea, right? I say this because I was telling this to Nicholas that my first major influence beyond my grandfather, who was my first great teacher for many, many years, was an intellectual figure, still alive, still writing books, like 30 books at this point, ridiculous levels of production. This figure was also very cruel in certain ways, but it was very much a master-disciple relationship at about 18 when I first started learning philosophy from him, learning theories from, learning literature from him. And I remember that he would rant and rave in the midnight hours. And for the first 2 or 3 years of our interactions, I only had the right to form statements in the form of questions. It was just understood. Now that was about power and about courtesy and about humility at a certain level. But it also made me realize there's something technical that occurs when, which is why some of you who took a class with me, I think maybe 2 semesters ago, I mentioned this, that one of my favorite unspoken genres of mysticism are books of questions. There are weird monastic literatures where some monk, usually anonymous, or a collection of monks or mystics, wrote books of questions. And they're just these hanging, suspended, bizarre suggestions of possibility that don't try to even answer themselves. But you realize 95% of the philosophical work is done in the formulation of a question that doesn't seal itself in the answer. It's all there. They didn't need to actually answer it. So let's do this. And what I would look for is just come up with an original kind of speculative, words abused these days, conjectural kind of hypothetical relation. What happens to evil in a certain space? What happens to evil in a certain relationship to an object? Again, what happens to evil of a certain figure? Fill in the blank, choose one and connect it to something else and formulate it as a question, and then let's take it from there. So who has a starting one? Throw us out. Like, what is the relationship between evil and piracy? How are pirates their own interesting brand of evil?
May I go?
Yeah, of course, Khashoggi.
Oh, sorry. Also, I have to say I put my clock for 9 p.m. and I just arrived, and I'm really sorry for everyone. I really wanted to know, and this is coming from me having to watched and listened to the last classes that you did, is that I really want to know the relationship between evil and pleasure, or if whether or not, because we tend to think of it in a certain way that, you know,
great.
Evil.
Yeah. Keep going. Sure.
No, that's basically it. To always think of like evil, you know, in a very this is a presumption that is in my mind, that we tend to think of evil in a, you know, line somewhere on the, you know, this somewhere on, you know, not displeasure really, but it's tended. Yeah, I think I said what I needed to be said. I don't have better formulations of that, basically.
I love this question because I'm writing things down because it's just it's a lot. So first thing to know is that civilizations are typically formed originally through the outlawing or forbidding of 2 particular pleasure principles: incest and cannibalism. Okay, so that's an interesting thing, that actually the first definition of the movement from savagery or barbarism to civilization is the outlawing of those pleasures as evil pleasures. Note, by the way, historically, that sovereigns, meaning kings and queens, often partake precisely of those two pleasure principles, whereas no one else under the law is allowed to do that, right? So they inbreed kind of, you know, and they also, you know, there's the stories of the queens who, you know, eat the bodies of others and all of that. What's his name? Caligula of Rome used to cannibalize certain parts of it. Anyway, so that's a really interesting one. The other thing, though, is that I've always said one of the understudied things in literature and in philosophy, Khashoggi, is when supposed that tipping point when virtues can become vices. This really, really intricate precipice where we know this already. And actually, one of the only figures who I think did a decent job even noting it was Jung, who I don't sit around reading all the time. But Jung, when he said all of the good archetypes, like the good king, the benevolent king, can become the evil king, right? The fairy godmother can become the possessive, abusive mother figure, nagging, judgmental, and all of that, right? The innocent who, you want to save the poor child in the story and all of that, can become an idiot, too helpless, too weak, too frail. You follow? So all of these have a capacity. And we know this, that, I mean, again, love can become jealousy, love can become hatred, love can become envy, it can become possessiveness of a certain kind. All of these things. Courage can become arrogance, right? So all of these sort of supposed. So why do I bring this up? Because I think that one of the great tricks of evil is to demonstrate that little hidden portal whereby pleasures become pains and pains become pleasures. To show that there's a much more fluid, seamless kind of realm where they can exchange. And probably the best example of this is when Nietzsche, when he's describing the eternal return at the end of a passage in Zarathustra called on the vision and the riddle, he describes this shepherd who the last image he gives, it's an image. I love that it's just a pure image. He says Zarathustra's walking and he sees a shepherd who had gone to sleep and taken a nap in the mountains or in the hills. And a huge black snake has crawled its way down his throat and bit into his chest and is there. And he's just horrified. And Zarathustra, in his terror at seeing this image and seeing the man still alive but choking on this huge snake in his mouth, screams out, bite it. Like that's the only thing you can do, is actually to do what is more evil. Like it's bitten into you, bite it in half, right? And he says, at that moment that he listens to my counsel and bites the snake's body in half and spits the head out, he arises with some sensation of invincibility. And this is basically Nietzsche's connection of the eternal return to ecstasy at that moment. And he says, the exact definition is, "O life, how could I bear to go on living, and how could I bear to die now?" That nexus, that bizarre nexus of experience, whereby you wish you would die because it's just too much, but you also wish you were immortal and it would never end. That's Nietzsche's recipe of pleasure at its extreme limit. And it emanates from a highly evil experience of having to bite the body of a serpent in half that's crawled its way into your throat. By the way, Kafka also has a really, really awesome but eerie little aphorism story called The Vulture. Has anybody ever read it? It's about a guy who he's stuck on the street. A vulture has attacked him, and the vulture is just gnawing at his feet and eating him piece by piece, right? And Kafka almost says it first person, I think, where he says, I walk by him, just like Nietzsche was, and I counsel him, like, do something. And he says, no, he understands things. And if I aggravate him, he accelerates his feeding on me, and I'm helpless here. And Kafka, the narrator, says, I'll go home and get a gun to kill him for you. And the guy says, hurry quickly. And then he says, he looked into the vulture's eyes and he sees that the vulture understood what was going to happen. And so the vulture just makes a full fatal headlong plunge into the throat of the man, places its beak into his esophagus, and blood is spurting out the torn esophagus. And the only last satisfaction is that he knows that the vulture is choking on his blood too. Again, you don't bother me. Go ask Kafka what the hell is happening there. Very enigmatic, very awesome thing. But the idea that that exceptional kind of pleasure precisely comes from the the fusion or the hybridity of pain and what we would call pain and pleasure. That ecstasy is precisely that outer boundary where we cannot tell the difference anymore. That's a really interesting one. And I said before, the vampire's bite was always described as unbearable pleasure, like too much excessive pleasure, right? If you look at rituals of purging, like the vomitoriums of ancient Rome, there was also a conception there of certain levels of consumptive pleasure that hit a point where they then spiral into pain or into disease or into interesting notion. But yeah, definitely great. Evil and pleasure. Excellent.
Sorry, just one thing. I know there are a lot of hands up, and I will just say this quick because, you know, like I just realized when you mentioned the Nietzsche quote, I just realized that we have, you know, in Farsi we have the idea of wajd wujud, and like how Mullah Sadra basically uses that as a phenomenology, which comes from an idea of ardor or of ecstasy or of an increased state of being that is basically used for being itself. That's
absolutely, absolutely. And we can talk about that when we get into mysticism. Sort of Sufism has been somewhat reductively known for this, but it is correct, even historically, that the idea of ma'rifat, which is a kind of bliss or delight or delirium, is always synonymous with fana, which means annihilation. So ecstasy is only achieved in annihilation, which is a great idea. Interestingly, that's a property that's associated with God, not with evil as the ultimate good, but cool. Either way, that's what makes them cool.
I think next we can go to Akshat.
Great, Akshat, go ahead.
Hello, Jason. So, like again, I think with that Kafka story that you were talking about, Sadek Hidayat also has like the story where the vultures kill like an innocent dog, and it reminded me of that. With respect to my question about the relationship between evil and something, the relationship between evil and objects that we love in our lifetimes. So
nice.
Not the relationship between evil and objects, but the relationship between evil and objects that have had love poured into them over a lifetime.
Well, okay, so then excellent. There's no answer to that. There's just, let's keep breaking down this great equation into more compartments. So there can be the evil of, let's say, a found object, which is like Gollum's ring in Lord of the Rings or in The Hobbit, right? His precious that he craves kind of to the level of self-deterioration. He becomes kind of horrifically emaciated and inhuman because he pours all his sort of passion into the object that he loves. Then there's sentimental objects, which are like inherited objects, like your grandmother's ring or your grandmother's necklace or something like that. That's a slightly different thing, but that has an element of ghostliness that's associated with it. So it's not something you covet the way that there's a weird thing about Gollum's ring. He covets it, meaning he jealously desires it even when he has it, which is weird because you think that when you have it, you know, my precious, there's this possessiveness. You wouldn't have the anxiety or the paranoia, you know, of not having it. But it's precisely, God, I don't want to quote Jacques Lacan here, but it's precisely where Lacan very correctly describes the inability of romantic partnership to ever purely double you. So if we want jouissance, like the ecstasy of unification, sex and love are never going to do it perfectly for us. Because you're never going to actually be able to put them inside you permanently, which is what the desire is. The desire is to make it one with you again. You can only simulate it temporarily, right, in the erotic encounter, but you can't actually fully integrate it into your being again. You follow? So it's always a failed simulacrum of the lost double, right? That is the impossibility of unity. But that's a weird thing that's going on with Gollum's ring, that even when it's his, it's not good enough. It's not in him enough. It's not on him enough, and all of that. Interesting thing, he also doesn't wear it. He just fondles it continually, which is interesting. But the other type of object that you love has an element of ghostliness to it, because it's an inheritance of the dead, typically. That's another sort of compartment then. So there is a trace of evil there, because the interesting question is, Akshat, evil is often about influence and the ability to influence in almost paranormal ways, which, by the way, is not supernatural, because memories influence you even though those events have transpired already, right? The dead do influence us, right? They can still construct, resentment and they can inspire, or they can do all. The dead have a lot of power. So the object of someone who is foregone, someone who has been eclipsed in time and space, that haunting effect is a very powerful dimension, and it's something that evil definitely knows how to manipulate very, very well, through things that we love, precisely. And then there's the granting of wishes, which is that evil offers you, many times in movies you'll see, offers you a shiny object, right? From Snow White's red apple, to a diamond, to something else, right? And that's what hinges or latches you into a certain malevolent destiny. Cool. Nicholas, what else we got? Thank you, actually.
Thank you. Andrew McCarroll.
Yes. So, the question, mainly this is a question that's more been a sort of resolved question in some ways, but there's an interesting fracture in it, especially in modern sort of internet culture and that sort of thing, which is the relationship between evil and persona. In other words, in how much can it be said that if evil is done anonymously or pseudonymously, that the evil act is done by the person beneath the anonymity or pseudonym, and how much is done by the pseudonym itself, or the persona that the pseudonym is supposed to represent, or even maybe something else entirely.
Good. I would note that it is predominantly evil organizations or associations, whether it's mafia, whether it's hip hop artists, whether it's graffiti artists, whether it's rebels, political rebels who like nicknames, and the Wu-Tang Clan, I think every member has like 42 sort of nicknames, right? Inspector Deck, the Ghostface Killer. I mean, they all have these amazing sort of nicknames that are very elaborate, that have coded meanings that only they understand in their own esoteric language. Blackbeard the Pirate. I mean, if you think of outlaws in the Wild West, as well as, again, so it's an interesting thing. Even in someone in the chat, I did read the chat for the first time, I think, ever. Someone mentioned if, I don't know if it was you, Andrew, if I would mention Keanu Reeves's Constantine, film Constantine. Someone mentioned that. And actually, it's in Constantine where the devil is played by a very talented Swedish actor, Peter Stormare, at the end. And when the angel Gabriel, played by another talented actress, Tilda Swinton, says to him, most foul, something like spoiled by God, like all these things, he goes, oh, how I miss the old names, right? And he kind of lavishes in that. It's the same effect of the outlaw in the Wild West who adores the notoriety of their outlaw poster, their wanted poster, and who looks at it and all that. The nickname is even if it's one based in infamy, is synonymous with achieving a higher level of existence, right? Because it means that you've attained some exceptional stratum whereby banal names no longer suffice. You have to be awarded with some type of new category, And by the way, I would mention something that Foucault, the great theorist of power, overlooks in his reference to amazing institutions like amazingly bad institutions like insane asylums and hospitals and prisons and schools and all of that, is that they historically emerged not simply as the spontaneous need for bourgeois cultures to identify themselves historically and form new metropolises that were based on that purged the unwanted. No, there's actually insane people walking around who necessitated the construction of an edifice. You follow? In the same way that Golgotha, where Christ is slung up on the cross, is necessitated by actual criminals and heretics who are populating Europe. I'm not saying that it's justified. I'm not saying they should be killed or they should be persecuted. I'm saying that schizophrenia came before the insane asylum did. Now, it is correct, Foucault's diagnosis, that the insane asylum then mass produces schizophrenia or madness, or prisons create criminality in the aftermath. But I like to give our deviant ancestors the first shot. They are the originators. And what's awesome is all these terminologies of the law that we have that are illegal things, crimes, right? From embezzlement to fraud to larceny to all these things. Someone had to do that first before it had a name. And I'm intrigued by those figures who are so radical in their violations that they necessitate creatively the invention of a new term or of a new title, which is to your question, in a point. Cool. And by the way, it's always, I don't want to always dialectically do this, but sometimes on occasions like this, it will be helpful to think about the goods relationship to naming, right? So if you take your biblical origin stories, remember that it is Adam's first task, is to name all the different creatures of creation in order to differentiate them, which is to say to control them, right? This is also where deconstruction has a problem that it doesn't like to admit, which is that difference is a really sexy, cool concept. I was a student of Derrida for 2 years, mesmerizingly smart figure, but nevertheless, that's how the whole bad game of society started too, difference. And he knows that. He just doesn't like to admit that. De Saussure understood that in linguistics, by the way, that it's through differentiation. The only reason rat is because it's not cat, right? But that's a very simple formulation. But the point I want to make is that not only is it the first task of creation to name things, but remember God's relationship to the name. So in Islam, there's 99 names. Sure, that's great. But it's only because there's an original unpronounceable name, right? So that's when Moses goes and says to God, what's your name on the mountain? And God says, I am that I am. Which means don't ask, you idiot, because if I say it, your head explodes, right? You annihilate. It's unspeakable to you. And that's why Orthodox Jews still write G-D, or they write some variation of that. But that, even if they had written G-O-D or Jehovah, it is still not the name. The name is unknown, right? Because the name is pure destruction. Why? That's a weird thing. Why is the name of God devastating? It's an interesting concept too, that's related to that. All right, go ahead, Nicholas.
Okay, so we have Frederick.
Hello, Jason. How are you? It's a pleasure
Hello,
to
good to
see
see you. Nice to see you again, Fred.
Of course, yeah. So my question goes more to the relation between space, body, and time in some way. And how does evil sort of replicates its signature in the multidimensionality of its architecture, or whatever you want to call it? And how is that somehow related to the presence of its own portrait and its own selfie, how it's just facing itself, but through a technology, like creating a fourth wall, in a sense.
Mm-hmm. Wow, it's great. Those are 2 or 3 separate questions. Let me start with the first element of it, the signature. One of the reasons why I don't have some unconditional worship of Friedrich Nietzsche. I think he was very precious to my own formation as a thinker, to which I'm eternally grateful. Came at the right time to get me in this case. That's why I'm here talking to all of you. So when we talk about how ghosts can do real good damage or set trajectories in motion, again, he's definitely one of the great ones for me. And one of the things that, and again, it's not to say that there aren't 1,000 things that I could refuse in him, but one of them is, I've always said, the exceptional level of variability of his writing. And that's only a handful of writers. Fernando Pessoa has this ability. There's few writers who can really stray into immense spectrums of topics and styles. And Nietzsche is an early practitioner of this, really. Kierkegaard too. If you look at either or, his sort of multivocal, multi-charactered kind of narrations of things. Dostoevsky tries really pathetically in Brothers Karamazov. Brilliant book, but it's always Dostoevsky. Nietzsche actually is a ventriloquist who can be the most. That's why I love it. He's known as the most macho writers. Philosophize with a hammer. You know that the #1 accusation of him in German culture for the first 40 years after his writing was he was too effeminate. Right? All these very delicate lyrical vulnerabilities in his writing, and all of that, the stillest hour, these were seen, and that's why he was also dismissed by philosophy as a poet for a long time. Just these kind of stupid categorizations. But what's amazing to me is, I've said this a million times, Nietzsche can, in The Gay Science, for instance, can write about music, he can write about suffering, he can write about Greek Dionysian rituals, he can write about a million things in a million different styles, some essayistic, some poetic, some philosophical. You can always tell it's Nietzsche. There's some signature there that, not despite the variability, because of the variability, in a weird way. It's like there's only one person who could go there. Do you follow? In a way, by the way, that Sartre condemned Bataille. There's a lot of Bataille fans in the room. I'm one of them. I think Bataille is one of the most striking, gorgeous writers ever to walk the planet. But Bataille sings one note most of the time. And Sartre's accusation of him, and it's a great note. It's one of the best notes that ever has been sung. But he's like that artist. He's like a Rothko. He's got that trick. That is awesome, but it's one thing. Now, Bataille also covers a million concepts and stuff. But stylistically, I don't think he's as variable, even though he writes pornography and he writes poetry and he writes anthropological essays. I shouldn't say that about Bataille. He's all over the place too in a brilliant way. But there's something ridiculous about Nietzsche's immensity, and this is what I want to give out, that is a signature that then, I've said this in other places, that Heidegger is attracted to, Bataille is attracted to, Deleuze, Baudrillard, Sartre, Derrida calls him the first deconstructionist. The Dadaists are attracted to him, the surrealists, the futurists. What the hell? I mean, this is weird. Like, why is he a calling figure to all of them? That's part of his evil signature, that it's able to imprint itself weirdly almost on any surface. And in that sense, I would use the brilliant metaphor of Michel Serres, where he talks about the blank domino, or the wild card in poker, or the skeleton key, which is a piece that can go in any place, can fit in any hole. There's something beautifully evil about Nietzsche's writing that can do that can attract everyone. You guys know, I mean, simultaneously at the same historical time, Nazis and hippies both adored Zarathustra. Now, some of you may be sly and slick and say there's not such a far cry between, let's just say at the most obvious doctrinal level, there's a huge difference, right, between Nazism and the hippies. Both adored. Now, how is it then that the devil, supposedly, or an evil figure, would come into this prismatic, kaleidoscopic virtual space of ours, and for every single one of us would devise his own strategy, his own little device, his own little music box to play just its own melody to enchant each one of us, but it's still the same figure. And we would all recognize it as the same figure to some extent, right? That's an interesting question of how that occurs. I take that, and we'll get to that fourth wall that you mentioned too. That's a really fascinating one. But let's say that's I think implicit to the task of how that's done. I mean, even at the most, I'm not giving myself credit as an evil master here, but even this practice of my responding to each one of you individually, off the cuff, spontaneously, and trying to summon memories of things that will play like certain piano notes just for the question that you asked. That is part of the sensitivity, the impromptu sensitivity. Deleuze, by the way, identifies it in Massoch. He says Massoch, the actual historical figure, not the writer. The historical figure who used to wander from town to town and enchant people with weird little contracts and games. And if you want another figure if you want to read one of the coolest introductions of 5 pages ever written, there was an avant-garde writer by the name of Blaise Cendrars, whose real name is not Blaise Cendrars, who wrote a book called Mohaghegh, which literally means death in the vagina, about we talk about an evil character, really evil character, kind of like Maldoror of Lautréamont. But read the introduction, and the actual figure Blaise Cendrars, that's not his real name, was known for just wandering around cities in Europe throughout his life, meeting strangers and trying to capture them in some momentary occasion where they would play out some strange, intricate game together and then disappear. So that is an interesting figure as well to contemplate. That's part of that signature. Excellent. Go ahead.
So, sorry. So I had written down that Shu, that you had raised your hand, and now you re-raised your hand. So
yes, hi. I have a question about the relationship between evil and silence. Is it more dangerous when evil is spoken to or spoken of? And does evil transfigures itself when we speak of it? So
wow,
yeah,
brilliant
so
question.
Generally, what is the relationship between thoughts and evil?
Well, you said silence originally, right? So that was the real thing. My third book was on silence. I wrote a book on silence because I noticed it as an undercurrent that a lot of my favorite writers of both East and West, from Blanchot on the western side to Forough Farrokhzad, this great Iranian woman poet, they all were really infatuated by silence, but they always danced around it in a strange way. Like it was always a second motif or a subcurrent. So in The Literature of Space by Blanchot, for instance, he's writing about space, but then he gets really interested in silence, in different places. But he can't quite pinpoint what it is. Nietzsche also, by the way, interested in silence. Bataille also interested in silence. Read Inner Experience. It's all over the place. Evil has a definite relationship to silence, and it's an excellent question. First of all, there is nothing more upsetting or disturbing to a ruler, a political ruler, than if you don't answer. Okay? It's considered the greatest form of disrespect. Not to curse them, but to just not even answer. And Sufi mystics throughout history are famous for being executed in silence, meaning neither pleading nor defending nor opposing the power structures. And the way that you can tell they really get at the heart of those power structures or those reality regimes and threaten them is the excessively violent way in which they're killed. beheaded, set on fire, limbs amputated or severed, you know, really, really grotesque. Rasputin, the dark monk of Russia, was famous for just gazing and glaring in silence at people, and they felt shudders down their spine. They felt he was invading their minds and reading their secret thoughts. Silence is really powerful. And the last thing I would say to that is that Beckett, Samuel Beckett, who I mentioned earlier, one of the most talented authors maybe of all time, the one stage direction that you will find throughout, riddled like bullet holes throughout every single moment of his plays, is parentheses, pause. He's continually telling his players to pause, because there's something really radical that happens, something electric that happens in the silences there, right? And it is slightly evil, because those silences are, they always, I can tell you what they do in Beckett's world. They threaten to unmask the artificiality, the constructedness, and the radical meaninglessness of things, right? So someone says something, where should we go today? That dramatic pause is not dramatic. It's actually the opposite. It's a disintegrative pause, where all of a sudden you start to realize the absurdity of the question. What are we, where should we go today? It doesn't matter. There's nothing to be done, right? As he says. So just if you let a few seconds lapse into silence, all language starts to tremble a little bit, gets nervous, meaning starts to disappear, identity starts to shake, right? The house of cards becomes manifest. So it's a great question. Evil does use that. And last thing I would say to you is, remember Harry Potter's lesson. This is an old, stolen, thieved archetype, that evil is that which cannot be named, right? Evil is that which you should not dare name, because the idea is that to speak it is actually to increase its proximity and likelihood, right? Which is an amazingly powerful relationship to language that I wish we still had. Because part of the symptom of our disenchantment, of our contemporary disenchantment, is the loss of the radical potentiality of the utterance to bring about the event, right? We're in such a hyper-mediated, hyper-symbolic, hyper-metaphorical sort of era of expression that you can say anything. That's why there's no shock value left. You can say anything and it has no consequence, right? Whereas evil is precisely, hey, if you think it, it's going to happen, right? And it plays, by the way, upon the child's imagination, where if you tell a child, think of anything but pink elephant, they can't think about anything but a pink elephant, including probably you guys too. You know, it's an interesting temptation to the forbidden that is there, right? But what if you imagine that, what if I were to tell, and this is when we get to Tomino's Hell, that Japanese work that I was talking about. What if someone were to deliver a book to you, a stranger came by and said, this is a book of miraculous powers. You will be enhanced and accentuated in all kinds of ways. But somewhere in some silent part of the universe that you have no contact with or knowledge of, someone else will suffer in some immeasurable way. The interesting crossroads of that decision, right? It's an intriguing one. Remember the old existentialist, if a tree falls in the woods and it doesn't make a sound. That's not a great old Buddhist riddle. That's an existentialist example. And the answer is absolutely not, according to existentialism, because if it occurs outside of my perception, then it didn't happen. But men play the game that, according to that logic, and that gives you license to trample and burn entire regions of existence as long as they stay out of perception, which has a dangerous political ramification when you consider the fact that the concentration camps were never in the center of German cities, and the gulags were in Siberia, and Guantanamo Bay is offshore of the United States. So they even the political universe plays at this little perceptual trickery. As long as it's, you know, see no evil, hear no evil. Look at the expression. I made a nice little connection there to a stupid expression. But the point being that it has to do with silence, right? For sure. Excellent, excellent. What do you have there for us?
So the next is Rodolfo, but I also just want to remind that we have about 7 minutes, and we can also go over, of course, but yeah.
Right ahead. Rodolfo, go ahead, please.
Hi, Jason. It's
Hello.
a pleasure to see you again.
Same here.
I was wondering first about the idea of this Spinoza idea about experience taught him that everything that happens in ordinary life is pain, but he saw that whatever it has caused an object of fear doesn't have anything of good or evil, but the effect that caused excitation in his soul. You know,
excitation, you said. Excitation. Okay.
Excitation in his soul. Yeah. So I was wondering about the, you know, the evil as a realization of in a non-moral, you know, and it can go, yeah. How evil works when there's no a moral or a good or a standard of what is good.
This is a great question, because if we take evil out of the domain of moral universes and into the domain of amoral universes, right? We can do this with violence too. So the child who draws in crayons all over the walls of the house, they're not meaning to inflict violence on the house, but they've done it. They've ruined the walls, potentially, if you perceive that as ruining the walls. But then they look at you with that innocence, sort of it was an action. It has neither sort of one or the other. Interesting thing I would note to your point. So we'll definitely dwell and dabble in amoral sort of sectors and see what happens when evil is neither tied to the good or what we would call the bad, but rather kind of drifts in neutrality in a certain way, or in its own currents, which have no. I think actually the best figure for that, who I would think would keep you great company, who experiments with that, is Henri Michaud. Michaud's characters are like, what are they? Are they good? Are they evil? They're neither. They're monsters who, you know, hang out on staircases, and, you know, sort of they're unbelievable, but they're amazingly powerful, and they often do violent things. They rip off faces. They do strange things. Read The Land of Magic again, you'll see that. But they're not moral or immoral. Now, the thing I would notice is that interesting special detail about your friend Spinoza is he was excommunicated, right? So he himself was designated evil, right? In his own time, and actually had to suffer the destiny of becoming the outsider, of becoming the banished, which is one of the old prices of evil. Remember, it's the first price of Adam and Eve. It's the first price of Satan. It's the first price of Cain. They're all banished in a certain way. Cain then gets also the added thing of being marked, which is an interesting thing, which we can talk about at some point. Michel Serres writes something beautiful in The Five Senses about what it means to be marked, like Cain. But anyway, the last thing that I wanted to say to that is, so when I wrote my book, Omnicide, there's a table of contents of, like, I don't know, 147 different manias, right, that are there. Cataptromania, the obsession with mirrors, the xyromania, the obsession with razors. Here's something that I haven't revealed to anybody. I actually got that list from looking at phobias. And I just twisted it. And I thought, what if being afraid of razors or mirrors or the ocean, or what if it could become a desire, kind of a compulsive desire? And it's very easy. It can be, right? So the thing is, that tells you that the phenomenon or the object originally has no value associated with it, right? Now, the interesting question then is, now this is where I would say excitation. Could you take the most feared object and turn it into the most manic object for you? Could you turn it into an object of desire? And what I would love as a principle potentially is that evil at its best can do that. Can take the thing you're most, arachnophobia, the fear of spiders, and turn it into arachnomania, the obsession with spiders. And I hate to give credit to this, but you guys know that's Batman, right? Batman is terrified of bats originally, and then he turns it into the object of his fulfillment, or of his desire instead. How do you do that is the interesting question, right? And the other question is, could it go the other way too? Right? A kind of reverse excitation where all of a sudden the most desired becomes the most feared. And definitely that is one of the characteristics of God in God's moments of wrath in the Old Testament. Right? That's Noah's flood. That's Sodom and Gomorrah. That's when you don't want to mess with this abusive deity in the wrong mood, on the wrong day. Right? And I find it a fascinating downgrade theologically that occurred from Judaism to Christianity, and then Islam took this as well as a legacy from Christianity, that originally evil was the work of God. There wasn't God and the devil in a kind of equal polarization or binary. Instead, it was just God on a bad night. If there's a whirlwind, if there's an earthquake, if your firstborn dies, that's God. God in his bad moods, bad hours, right? Then it had to be split. This was untenable in the formation of an increasingly socialized moral universe. And so there had to be a scapegoat, right? But again, as you know, Rodolfo, and Spinoza knows this too, by the way, it doesn't answer the problem of then, well, the old theological question, but didn't God create the devil? Doesn't God let the devil do his thing, which is complicity? And is God not aware? Because if God's not aware of the devil, then he's not omniscient. Or if God can't interfere with the devil, then he's not omnipotent. So there's even massive holes and defects in that logic, that go there. But it's all okay if we just restore evil to the universe as a playing card, not the playing card, not the absolute necessarily, which is something we'll talk about in the horror movies, because I think where our generation is going slightly too far in this new kind of transcendental, immaterial, the universe itself is evil. And that's what we'll see in our films that we watch and all that. I think it's a brilliant move rather than having like one, crazed predatory monster that chases you. It's much cooler to say, no, everything. The wind is evil. The stones are evil. Our breath is evil. Language is evil. That's cool. But I like it if it's just not is evil, but possesses molecules of evil potentiality. That's a better way to give it a slightness and a subtlety, and also which then allows it to be more variable. Anyway, Nix, do you want to give someone, thank you so much, Rodolfo. You want to give someone the last question, and then we'll call it a day.
Sure. I think it's Alberto. I think that you're...
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Of course.
Hello, Jason. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too.
My question is, what is the relationship between evil and old age? Because as you say, evil is socially related to the youth and beauty. And in many stories, it's the wise elders who represent the good. But in cultures such as Japan, the elderly can also be perceived as the image of perversion and the evil. That's my question.
No, it's a great question. The figure of the witch in the forest is a great one to look at, because historically there are examples in folklore and in literature precisely what you just said, Alberto, sort of older figures representing not just the sage, or the caretaker, sort of the nice grandmother, the benevolent grandmother, or the elder monk who sort of is the wise person of the village or something like that. Yes, there's also the prototype of the witch. There's also the prototype of the original Greek gods, the three sisters who share the eye, the sisters of destiny, and they are grotesque and they are elderly, whereas all the other Greek gods are young, and muscular and sort of at the height of their physical prowess. But what I love is that if you look at the Greek mythological arrangement and alignment of forces, Zeus is terrified of them. The Olympian god, the father figure, the master of the universe, the lightning bolt thrower, whenever he is told that the only way to escape the clutches of, of some event or some situation is to go bargain or beg or plead to the three fates, the three old witches, he never wants to go. He tries to find an excuse and to elude any encounter with them, because their hideousness, and also the fact that they share that eye, that they share the eye, and also the fact that they, it's brilliant. They segment their techniques in a tripartite movement. So every individual fate, one is called the apportioner, one is called the allotter, and I forget the third. She's something like the collector or the reaper. But the three of them, one of them spins the thread, one of them holds the thread, and one of them cuts the thread, right? And the fact that it's a craft. Now, I've seen women who are great silk Persian rug makers, and I've seen craftswomen and craftsmen and artisans throughout history. It takes time to become a master rug weaver. So these women fates have to be displayed as old. Even if it's a cruel, evil craft of theirs to cut the fates of people and damn them to sort of their mortality, it can't be a young person. A young person would be too much of an amateur, right, to be able to pull off that amazing task. So it's a great question, yeah. And I love that those old women send shudders down the spine of Zeus and the others, and that they have their great parties on Mount Olympus and they pretend to rule the world, but they all know in the back of their minds that these hideous old women, these three old women, decrepit, living in some obscure cave, that they run the show, really. So anyway, on that note, for next week, thank you, Albert, thank you, everyone. For next week, we are reading our first figure, Arthur Rimbaud. You're reading the entirety of the selection of Season in Hell. I will warn you in advance that that's the only reading where the name of the file is actually my name, just because it was an old scan that I had done, that someone put my name as the title of it. So you'll find it though. Just look for Season in Hell by Rimbaud. I think it starts with, once there was a banquet where every wine flowed. That's the first kind of opening to it, and it's obviously Season in Hell by Rimbaud. We're going to read that really closely together. We're going to take it apart. It's stunning. Remember, you just mentioned, Alberto, the elderly person. Rimbaud is 18 when he writes this, and it's bizarrely good, like way out of the ordinary. So we'll read that now. Nicholas, we wanted to mention that presentations, Nicholas is going to circulate a presentation sheet. Presentations in this seminar, we're going to have some fun with this. I stumbled upon an amazing collection, a small anthology called Poems Dead and Undead, that are all, it's a collection of various short poems from all around the world, from every region, that deal with dead and undead creatures, vampires, werewolves, demons, angel, all kinds of stuff. But every week we will select 20 pages, so it'll be the first 20 pages of that for whoever's going to present next week. You are free to choose any one work from those 20 pages and to come up with principles of evil, descriptions of evil, formulations of evil based on that one work. What I love about that is it's not going to be something that we cover in class already. We'll be reading Rimbaud, but then at the end, we're going to get 3 new poetic works that no one has read before, and you'll just weave us through it. And again, side by side, kind of what we did with like The Dead King Eats the Gods, align various principles with various suggestions. And it doesn't have to be in the form of a philosophical statement. It can just be even a spider web of connections. Just even taking the right inventory of saying, notice this space was mentioned, notice this figure is mentioned, notice, this descriptive adjective is here. All of those are clues that help us create a witch's cauldron, of something cool. All right. So Nicholas will send you an email to follow up. Nicholas, you want to say anything at the end here?
No, just thank you all, and I'll be sending out a spreadsheet with everything. You can send an email to me or to organizers if you're missing anything, and I know some of you might be missing the text from the drive. Just let me know, and I'll help. So yeah,
Take care, everyone.
all.
See you next week.